Welcome to our 82nd podcast for Thanks for Your Service. Our focus is on historical topics relating to the Australian military. You can find us on Facebook, X and YouTube. Just search for Thanks for Your Service. Our website is www.thanksforyourservice.net and you can email us at info@thanksforyourservice.net. Who would have known that during World War II, the Goulburn Valley in Victoria housed nearly 10,000 prisoners of war and internees in 7 purpose-built camps? John Gribben joins us to give us an incredible insight into these camps. Joining us on the line from Shepparton in Victoria is John Gribben. And John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be with you, David.
Now, we're here to talk about PoW camps in the Goulburn Valley during World War II. So I think my first question is, where is the Goulburn Valley?
The Goulburn Valley relates to the Goulburn River, and it's in central Victoria. And I suppose the largest town in the Goulburn Valley is probably Shepparton.
We're here to talk about the PoW camps, which I had no knowledge of, but the Goulburn Valley played an important role during World War II with these camps. Can you first tell us a little bit about the camps, and then we'll go into the role of each of the camps?
Okay. Well, initially, before the Second World War, people had started fleeing Germany and going to England. And I think they were getting overwhelmed by these refugees. And the Australian government initially said, look, we'll take in 15,000 refugees or whatever. So the British government actually paid the Australian government a little bit of money to set up these camps. But of course, as things progressed and as war came upon us, we ended up having to house a whole heap of internees and prisoners of war in Australia during World War II.
How many camps were there in the Goulburn Valley during World War II?
There were actually camps all over Australia, in every state of Australia, but the greatest concentration of camps was in the Goulburn Valley. To give you an idea, there was about 7 camps in this area, housing about 10,000 prisoners of war and internees, and that equates to around about over a third of all the prisoners of war and internees in Australia during that time.
Why was the Goulburn Valley selected?
It's a very interesting spot. First of all, it's a long way from a population centre. Weather was generally good. We had good rail here. It's the food bowl of the country in an aspect, so it wasn't hard to get food. But the real crucial thing for the area was water. And the Goulburn Valley has established a great irrigation scheme. So there was many canals and things that we have in the area. So we could provide water for all these camps, as much water as they wanted all year round. And that's basically why it's here.
If you could take us through some of the camps and the role of each. So which one do you want to start off with? We've written here Camp 1, which was the Nazi internment camp, for example. Do you want to start there?
Yeah, well, so I'll give you a quick story on each one too, if I can. Camp 1 is the first purpose-built camp. Actually, it's the first and last of the purpose-built camps in Australia during World War II. Now, it was known as the Nazi camp because if you were in the Australian Nazi Party before World War II, and we did have an Australian Nazi Party, you probably ended up in this camp. It was for civilians. The camp's quite interesting because it is the only camp in Australia that was fully sewered. So a lot of them had long drops and latrines and, with buckets and things. But this one was fully sewered because it was the first of the purpose-built camps. They also built a 100-bed hospital with this camp to prevent diseases and things because people were coming in from the Middle East, they didn't know what was going on. So they fully sewered this camp, and it had sewage before any of the local townships of nearby Tatura and Mooroopna. So, yeah, it was quite an elaborate sort of a setup. But I'll tell you one little story about the camp, which is a bit interesting. At this camp, they had a secret radio. Now, there's a guy by the name of Håkon Nielsen. Håkon himself was a Norwegian. We weren't at war with Norway, but during the start of the war, he was on a ship and he was going up and down the east coast of Australia. And he had a fascination with amateur radio. Anyhow, we had a falling out with the ship's captain, And the captain said to the Australian authorities, "Oh, I think this guy's a spy." So he ended up in this German internment camp. Apparently, it was 6 weeks before he found someone else that could speak Norwegian. But anyhow, he was at this camp, and he said to his mate one day that he finally could speak to, he said, "Look, I do hand radio, and I could build you a hand radio set that you could listen in overseas." Anyhow, the camp leaders at this Nazi camp, they said, "Oh, well, we'll do a bit of a scavenger hunt and see what we can get for him." And they stole a valve off a projector set and found a bike wheel and turned it into a generator and stole acid and whatnot. And eventually they built this radio for this bloke. And he wasn't a German, but he said, "Well, I'm just stuck here doing nothing, so I might as well do something I like." So at night, they dug a hole under his cabin and they built this radio, and he would go and have a stenographer with him, and they'd be recording everything. So, and they, with all the information they got, they had an illegal camp newspaper that they used to publish. And in this newspaper, they give them the Bundesliga football results, and they do Hitler's speeches word for word, verbatim. It was really incredible. If you can imagine what Radio Australia, what news it provided, basically they were getting all this news as well. Anyhow, at this camp, at one stage, they knew they were going to get raided, and so they took out the radio and left a few parts, and eventually they got caught. Now, Hawken himself used to come back to Australia after the war and used to talk to some of the people at Tatura, and he was talking to a guy by the name of Internee, a local identity at Tatura. And Arthur said to him, "Look, if you had a radio, how did you get an antenna? Because, normally you have these big poles and wires between." He goes, "Oh, yeah, no." He said, "What happened was we told the guards, look, the roof's leaking." So they said, "Well, you know how to fix it." So that's all right. So they pulled the iron off the roof and they put Melthord and rubber down and whatnot. And ultimately they ran a wire up to the roof, and the roof was their antenna. Like, it was incredible. And so listening to Hitler and all the rest of it. Anyway, a year later, Arthur's talking to this guy, goes, "Hey, how did you know you were going to get raided?" He goes, "Oh, well, we had the garrison's phone tapped." And a year went by, and he goes, hang on a tick. They wouldn't have let you go up a telephone pole and wrap a wire around the thing. No. I said, "What happened here? All the telephone cables were underground, and we had to do a lot of drainage works. And we knew where all the wires were. And we knew that if you could wrap a wire around the actual phone lines and hold it to a speaker, you could induce a sound. Now, that'd be all fine. What would happen on these work parties, they'd be digging across these wires, and invariably there'd be one man holding his jaw as though he's crook. But he wasn't crook. He was listening into all the conversations that the garrison had. And so it was like Hogan. It just reminded me of Hogan's hero.
Yeah, Hogan. They are ingenious, whether in fact or fiction, aren't they? Certainly, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a little bit about the secret radio.
Yeah, okay, so which one next? Camp 2, the male internment camp for German Jews?
Yes, yeah. Camp 2, Camp 2 was all German Jews. So if you can imagine, before England entered the war, a lot of Jews had fled to England because they'd already been persecuted by the Germans. And when the England entered the war, they said to Churchill, "Look, we've got all these Germans here. They say they're Jews, but we don't know. They could be spies." And Churchill said, "Look, let's just collar the lot." And they grabbed them all, and they sent half out to Canada and half to Australia. The half they sent to Australia, they come on a ship called the Dunera, which is quite a famous sort of a ship in itself. There was, I think after the war, some of the British crew on that Dunera were court-martialed. But anyhow, they come out on that boat. Initially, they went out to Hay, the camp there. But when they held the inquiry about what happened on the Dinera, they were out at Hay. It was like 42 degrees or something. They just said, shut it down and move them south. So it was just too hot. So they ended up coming down to Camp 2. The next camp is Camp 3. Camp 3 was full of German and Italian families. If you could imagine, as the Allied forces were going through the Middle East and they're in Palestine, they'd run into various German families, missionaries, some from the Templar Society. And even if we went in the islands, up around Singapore, there was a lot of Germans up in that area as well. So a lot of those German and Italian families were captured and relocated to Camp 3, which is on the western side of the Waranga Basin, not far from Tatura and Shepparton. I'll tell you one quick story there. There was a family there, the Sturzenhofiker family. After the war, they're waiting for a ship to take them home. And they had a little tin in their cabin that were drying nappies with. Anyhow, they went off to lunch. Unfortunately, one of the nappies caught fire. The cabin caught fire, and there was a lot of smoke. Anyhow, the child was pulled from the cabin, but it later died of smoke inhalation. And you can imagine this is October 46. So this is the war's over. They're just waiting to start their life over again, and this is what happens to it. So it's very tragic. But unfortunately, 1 month later, their near 2-year-old is walking around the camp, and an army truck backed over him and killed him. So they lose 2 children, only a month or so apart, after the war, while they're waiting to go home. So that was a bit of a tragic story there. The next camp I'll talk about is Camp 4. Camp 4 was for Japanese families. Now this is interesting. So if you were in New Zealand or Fiji or up in Indonesia or Northern Australia and you were Japanese or had Japanese descendants, you ended up at Camp 4. Interestingly enough, you can imagine there was even a half-caste Aboriginal lady who was in Camp 4 because her father was a Japanese pearl diver. It's a very interesting camp. There's a lot of documentation on this camp. One of the great stories I like about it is a story involving one of the commandants of this camp at one stage, who was a Mr. Scurry, Major Scurry. Now, Major Scurry is famous in that he helped invent the pop-off gun at Gallipoli during the First World War, with the dripping cans and what have you. And he got something. Anyhow, everyone really liked him. And in particular, the Japanese people liked him. A couple of reasons. One was that they used to have limited times when they'd have visitors come in once a month. And at one stage, they had orders from the army saying, your time's up, you've got to get out. And this went on. And when Scurry found out about this, he said, no. He told those auditors, you can bugger off. I said, what are you talking about? Their time was up. They said, no, that's a minimum amount of time. He says, some of these people travel a long way. If we can supervise the visitations for a longer period, screens between the visitors and the prisoners, and Scurry again said, no, we're not doing that either. We're going to treat these people well. So that was pretty good. But the story I want to share with you now is about Captain Sullivan, who was underneath Scurry at the time. And he thought, well, look, Scurry's about to leave as, they change over staff. And he said, look, I reckon we should have a dinner for him. They go, yeah, all the garrison said, that's a great idea. So they organised this dinner. Anyhow, 2 days out before the dinner, they say to Scurry, look, we better tell you before, you nick off to the pub or something. But we've got, the guys really like him. We're going to have a dinner for you in 2 days' time. And everything's sorted out. We've got guards coming in to man the guard towers for a few hours. It's all taken care of. And Scurry initially said, yep, that's fine. Great, thank you, all the rest of it. But the following day, Scurry called Captain Sullivan back and said, look, I've been thinking about this. It's all very well having a dinner and everything, but I feel real bad putting out all the other guards who are coming in to man the guard towers. So I've gone and cancelled them all. And Sullivan sort of, right. He said, but don't worry about it. He says, I've spoken to the Japanese camp leaders and I've told them, look, tomorrow night, there's not going to be anyone in the guard towers for a few hours. No one's going to escape, are you? And they said they wouldn't. And he said, and that's good enough for me. And that is exactly what they did. They had no one in the guard towers. They told their prisoners and no one escaped and it was all good. Goodness. So that's the story about Camp 4. They do run in order, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the camp. Camp 5 actually was over in Worali. It was for Italian officers. So, but that's not part of our camp set up here. Camp 6 was a woodcutter camp of around at Greytown, which is there. It was only a small camp. I should point out that all the other camps I've talked about are over 1,000 people, roughly between 1,000 and 1,500. But Camp 6 itself was only about 250 people. And many of the people that were cutting wood there were from the German raider ship, the Cormorant. And they used to supply firewood for all the camps for their cooking and heating of water, as well as provided firewood for the hospitals in Melbourne. So that's what happened there. At one stage, of course, at the start of the war, the Italians were in there and they had a record of, I think, 110 cubic meters or cubic yards of wood for the day. That was their best record. Well, of course, when the Germans moved in later, they said, oh, no, we'll beat that record. And so they bumped it up to 120 cubic yards of wood for the day. That was their record. There were numerous other camps around Australia. The next camp in the cluster around Tatura, known as the Tatura group of camps near Shepparton, was Camp 13. Now, Camp 13 was a prisoner of war camp. That's a large, high security. So we've got military guys from Italy, Germany, and Germany, and Japan. So very high security. 4,000 prisoners of war and internees. I might tell you a quick story about a guy by the name of Gustav Ponarth. Now, Gustav Ponarth was a World War I German who, between World War I and World War II, taught at various military colleges across Germany. And he was in Tobruk, and they said to Ponarth, he was head of the 8th Machine Gun Regiment for Germany, and they said to him, look, Ponarth, we want you to take 100 men and we want you to go out into that desert out there and capture that country. And Ponarth said, no, I'm not going. And they said, what are you talking about? Okay. He goes, I'm not going. He says, because you're trying to send me forward without any reconnaissance and without any heavy artillery backup. He said, that would be a suicide mission for my men. I'm not going to ask them to do it. He says, well, you have to do it. And apparently this argument goes on for about half a day until the people higher up, potentially Rommel, said, Ponarth, get your 100 men, get out there and capture that desert country. So he does this. He goes out. It's not long before they encounter an Australian patrol, and there's a firefight. Ponarth is shot through the neck and dies right at the start of this engagement. And as he died, all his men surrendered. But so revered was Ponarth that they wrapped his body up in a German flag and carried it off the battlefield. And when they got put in jail, they built a stone memorial for him because he stood up for them. Like, how unusual would that have been in the German army? That blood-stained flag now hangs in Canberra's War Memorial. And you're probably asking, well, why are you talking about this now? And the reason I'm talking about that is because that stone memorial for Ponarth was built out at Camp 13 and now sits out in a paddock just out at Murchison up here in the Goulburn Valley, all to do with Ponarth, a revered German officer. The other one here associated with Camp 13 is the Durangol Mansion. Now that, again, was linked to Camp 13, the Durangol Mansion, and it was for German officers and their batmen. So there was about 250, and that's not a big one either. But I suppose the story that's probably best known here, they had a big escape from there at one stage of around about, I think, 19 German officers and their batmen escaped, including, I should say, Theodor Detmers, Captain Theodor Detmers, who was the captain of the German raider ship that sunk off the West Australian coast. All those people were recaptured, but it was quite an interesting setup how they had it. They had to crawl through this sandhill of tunnels. All the guys were on the run, but they never lasted longer than about 2 weeks on the run before they were all captured. And that's the 7 of the camps in the Goulburn Valley.
Well, in terms of the mansion, was that the camp that you said, I think you referred to, that they had actually had a radio? They were able to communicate between the camps?
Well, yes and no. Where the Camp 1 was the actual where
the ham radio
they were listening
one.
to Berlin and all the rest of it. Yeah, there was a radio found at the Dorrigold Mansion. Though. One of the things at the Dorrigold Mansion, there's a big tower, and Detmers himself his bedroom was in the top of the tower. Well, Camp 1, they actually were able to signal to the tower through a pipe, so light couldn't get away, and they could let Detmers know how things were going in the camp. And I think my understanding was Detmers felt a lot better once he knew what was happening in the other camps. Now, having said that, after some time, after the war, the guy that lived at the Dorrigold estate, where the mansion was, he wandered through the house at one stage and found a loose board on the stairway up the tower. And in that, they also found another radio. Right. So, yes, he was able to communicate. They were able to communicate in a number of different ways. All the prisoners went to the dentist at Camp 1. And my understanding is they'd all go to the toilet. And in the toilet seat, there was a little hinge missing where they could fold up little messages and leave it in the toilet seat. So different people from different camps could actually see what was going on. So they were able to communicate in roundabout fashions from between the camps through various nefarious means. From
an Australian perspective, what was the size of the garrison performing security duties at the camps?
Yeah, it was, they were pretty undermanned in some respects. I was talking to some garrison members who were on these things some time back, and basically they'd only get 2 days off a month, and the working conditions were pretty bad. But to give you an idea, at Camp 1, for about 1,000 prisoners, they would have 250 in the garrison, and that's generally how they saw things. In terms of overall prisoners, I think we ended up with like 18,000 Italians, both military and civilians, in Australia during the Second World War. We had about roughly 1,500 Germans, and I think we had about 5,500 or 6,000 Japanese. The bulk of those Japanese being up at Cowra in New South Wales. But I should point out, when the breakout occurred, they moved a lot of those Japanese down to Camp 13. One little quick story there, my father can remember them coming through Shepparton after that time. And he said to me, John, he goes, I think the Australians might have given them a bit of a flocking. I said, why is that? And he goes, well, when they came through the Shepparton on the trucks, he said, they all had broken noses and black eyes and broken arms. And I never thought much about it until later on. I was in Cowra. I heard a tape of a guard, and the guard said, you know, when they all broke out, they said to us, look, they called us in, we've got 300 odd Japanese out in the countryside, we had to round up. They've already killed a couple of our men. And he said, we had to round them up. But he said, the first thing we did was to hand in our guns. And that saved many lives, because we rounded all these people up without guns. But then I realised, well, if they didn't have guns, they probably took with them tire levers and, axe handles, and possibly beat them up to within an inch of their life, I suspect, before they were rounded up. So when it sort of made a little bit more sense what my father had told me.
What exists of the camps today?
Believe it or not, there's still a fair bit there. The bulk thing in all the camps, you'll see the concrete slabs where the laundries, the toilets, the kitchens, you'll see all that. In some of the camps, they still have a fair bit of the barbed wire entanglements around the outsides of the camps as well. At a number of the camps, you'll also see the jail cells. So if people did things really bad, you could get put into a cell for 28 days. And there's a number of those there with still the graffiti from the prisoners in them.
All right, so I've recorded that. No, you've already answered it, unless you want to add something else to it.
No, it was in general terms, the garrison was only ever about a quarter of the size of the number of prisoners that they were, looking after.
Now, where can people go to find out more information about the camps?
There is a great place to go to, and that's at the Tachira Irrigation and War Museum Heritage Centre, which is opened every day of the week between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. They have a really excellent array of things. They really didn't get going until the 80s, and they've built on and about to create a really good list of things to see.
John, look, thank you so much for your time today. It's a really great insight into, again, a bit of Australian military history, which is really in our own backyard and not many people know about. So thanks for your time today.
More than happy to see everyone down here. Thank you, David.
That's the podcast for today. After I recorded this podcast and as part of a school holiday road trip, I packed up my two boys and we headed to Shepparton in Victoria and met up with John, who took us out to see the site of Camp 1 and the German War Cemetery. We also visited the Tatura Wartime Camps Museum, and thanks to Bill, who showed us around. I will post some photos and videos up to our social media feeds. We're keen to hear your feedback by leaving a review on your podcast app. Your reviews helps new listeners find our podcast. If you have any special requests or suggestions for our podcast, please get in touch. You can help support this podcast via Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. The links are on our website and Facebook page. Your support helps us with the production of this podcast. And do you have a relative who has served in the Australian military? Our family military history research packages sources records to better understand the service and experience of those who've served, and you can find out more information on our website. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your service.